Hey, it's Doug, and welcome to the Krewe Japan podcast, where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture. Welcome back to the podcast. This is part 2 of our sit-down with comedian and Japanese language YouTuber Dogen. In this episode, Dogen enlightens us on what pitch accent actually is.
Japanese is a little bit different in the sense that words don't have strong and weak bits. They have high and low bits in terms of tone.
How sometimes simpler is better when using Japanese.
Never use a complicated word when a simpler word can be used, and always try and use the least number of words to express a single thought.
And how an inadvertent word mix-up can make for a great story.
They're like, what on earth are you talking about? And, it's impossible to make that connection unless you realize that in English they're the same word.
Now enough of me blabbering on, let's dive on in. A way to pivot to, it's so awesome to hear. Hearing those success stories gives me hope that one day I can do that.
Yeah, I was in a very fortunate situation, and again, I think I was also in the unique situation of having the pitch accent knowledge and also knowing that most Japanese learners didn't know about pitch accent. So I kind of saw an opportunity there, and I was like, a lot of people said, like, specifically on that Reddit post, like, your pronunciation is, in particular, is quite good. How did you study Japanese? And I would say, well, I studied pitch accent and pronunciation kind of, what would you say? Well, yeah, specifically. And then again, people would always say, pitch accent, what's that? And I thought, okay, yeah, this aligns up with my experience in university as well, where I would learn about pitch accent, one of these books that I borrowed from the library. Then I would try and talk to my teachers about it or my classmates about it. And they would always be like, never heard of that. What's that? So I thought maybe we can start to have a discussion in the Japanese language learning community about pitch accent and make more people aware of this if it's something that they would like to learn. And the reason that I say that is because pitch accent is not at all necessary in order to be comprehensible to have a conversation in Japanese. It's really just for people that want to sound as native as possible. And you can immediately think of, many people that English is not their first language, maybe Hollywood star like, Jackie Chan. He's got a quite thick accent, but he's very, very fluent in the sense that he's very articulate. He can articulate his thoughts very, very well in English, and he can be funny in English, and he can say, deep things about martial arts in English as well. So it's the same in Japanese. Even if you have an accent, you can still say, you can be very articulate. And I think that there are many, many, many people that are more articulate in Japanese than I am, with less native-like accents. My accent is certainly not native, but again, it's just for people that if one of their goals is to sound as natural as possible, as native as possible, I certainly find that it is something that's worth studying.
Yeah, I find when I talk to university professors about, them teaching Japanese, one of the comments that they always tell me is it's so stressful to try and cram so much Japanese into one semester.
Yes.
And so I feel like pitch accent is probably not their main priority. They're just trying to get students to really comprehend the grammar and how to make those sentences and memorize those vocabulary and, memorize the hiragana, katakana, and start learning kanji.
I agree 100%.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you, what made you start going down the path of language proficiency as opposed to maybe the comedy sketches and then traveling throughout Japan and making videos, like travel vlogs or something like that. But it definitely, what you said in your last answer is, it makes sense why, and, it seems like certainly there was a lack of that too, and there's still, I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand, or they're not familiar with pitch accent until they are explained what it is, and then they know intuitively what it is. But it definitely seemed like, I think you were probably the very first YouTuber that I saw talking about pitch accent, and then I saw Matt vs. Japan, who we've had on the podcast before, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's really fascinating that you took that path, because I'm sure it had to be a little worrisome, because there wasn't that much content out there. You certainly couldn't have known if that would have succeeded, because I'm sure the travel vlogs seem like that's probably more of a surefire, thing.
Well, the thought that I had was the other people that I saw on YouTube that were making content related to Japan was basically exactly what you just mentioned, like kind of vlog style content. And I figured that it would be best to do something that other people aren't doing. I think that if you're the first person to market, so to speak, in any kind of thing, then that can be a major advantage. And I think that one of the reasons that, the J-vlogging did get really popular for certain people is because they were the first to do it. They were the first to show Japan from a street perspective, so to speak, to the outside world. And that's why, perhaps, again, with their very interesting personalities, that maybe certain J-vloggers got very, very, very popular. A lot of the people that I know, I would argue that people like Abroad in Japan, who I'm sure that you know, is kind of in a different category. I certainly don't consider him a J-vlogger. I consider him more of like I say J-director, because I feel like he makes kind of like proper pieces.
Yeah, he would appreciate that.
Yeah.
We just got that studio, so.
And I think that's how he ended up standing out. We're all kind of doing our own different unique things. And J-vlogging's one thing, kind of making proper documentaries, kind of more like what Tokyo Lens does, is one thing. And then what Chris does with kind of documentaries that are more kind of like comedic as well, that's one thing. And then I try and do kind of more like the language side of things. And I think it's because we don't overlap so much that we're potentially that much more successful in each of our own unique fields.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So one of the biggest parts about learning a language is honestly setting those realistic goals for yourself, which can seem really challenging at times because, you're trying to not make those goals that are like too far out of reach for yourself. Throughout your studies, Dogen, did you ever encounter times when you realized like you set your goals a little too high? And, what advice would you give for, setting those language learning goals?
That's a wonderful question. I certainly experienced that. And the biggest instance of me experiencing that was actually when I got that scathing feedback from my friend. Because, well, he gave me two pieces of advice. One was you're trying too hard. And the other one was your Japanese isn't nearly good enough to make this happen.
Whoa.
Yeah. And again, one of the reasons for that is actually because I was intentionally trying to write. I was under the impression that complicated prose, complicated written sentences were therefore, because they were complicated, they were therefore good. They were therefore sophisticated, so to speak.
Gotcha.
When I think that, who was it? God, I can't remember. 1984.
George Orwell?
Yes. I believe that one of the advice that he gives, which I try to stick to, is never use a complicated word when a simpler word can be used, and always try and use the least number of words to express a single thought. I'm pretty sure that he has that written down.
That's powerful.
Yeah. Written down somewhere. And again, one of the things I talked about towards the beginning of this podcast was I realized that I could communicate complicated ideas without writing complicated sentences. I could communicate complicated ideas with simple words, simple grammar. I just had to choose the right words. And I think that I'm certainly guilty of this. When you try to sound more smarter than you actually are, 9 times out of 10, it backfires, whether that's in your own language or in Japanese. And for the people that are setting up their own language goals right now, I would say, if you do try and punch above your weight, that can often backfire if you're trying to sound, again, smarter than you actually are, whether you're speaking Japanese or writing Japanese, and that can hurt your motivation. It's not bad to be a beginner in Japanese. That's just the natural thing if you're starting to learn Japanese. We were all there at some point. I was there at some point. We were all there at some point. And
Yeah.
you don't need to compare yourself to natives, to people that are much, much better than you. The better thing to do, in my experience, is to just concentrate on improving your own Japanese. And one of the things that I also like to really, really emphasize is that the best thing that you can do for your Japanese in the long run is study in a way that will, supplement your language goals. What I mean by that is, again, I teach Japanese pronunciation, and I do kind of arguably stand-up comedy in Japanese on my YouTube channel. So speaking for me is important. And in that sense, I try and do a lot of native immersion, listening to a lot of native speaking Japanese, because that's good for output as well. If you get a lot of input, you can do output more naturally. One of the things that I almost never do is study kanji, or to study new vocabulary words. And the reason for that is because, again, if my goal is to be funny in Japanese, the most important thing is not knowing a lot of complicated words and complicated grammar, archaic words, and very difficult kanji. The most important thing is being able to come up with funny ideas. And then to get to a point where my spoken Japanese is just good enough for me to be able to communicate those ideas. So the idea supersedes everything. That's king. And then the Japanese takes, the second place. But even within that second place, I've chosen specific things. I try and concentrate on my speaking, and I try and concentrate on, being able to create sentences that are good enough to communicate the idea. I don't try and punch above my weight, so to speak, because I know that that'll backfire again.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to become like a translator, or if you would like to become like a voice actor in Japanese, I think that's possible. Or if you want to become like a calligraphy expert and you want to do shodo, then you should try and study in a way such that when you're 3 or 4 years down the road, you don't end up realizing, wait a second, I've been studying in a way that is not enhancing, it's not leading up to those goals that I have, so to speak. Study in a way that that supplements the goals that you have for Japanese specifically.
Yeah. Well, I think that's good advice. So yeah, I'm sure our listeners will really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that makes a very big difference. If you know what you want to do, you can study with that in mind, and you can then accelerate your studies, so to speak. You can get to that point faster.
Yeah, and we kind of touched on this a little bit with what we talked about with YouTube, what we talked about with studying and finding your own niche. Mm-hmm. The online language studying community as a whole, there's little niches and pockets of everything, like people that specialize in different areas, and obviously your focus is pitch accent and, spoken language and pitch accent. Mm-hmm. We've talked about it a lot at this point, but I don't think we ever really kind of specify what pitch accent is. I can't even say the words pitch accent. I need to work on my pitch accent. So for those who are unfamiliar, how would you best define pitch accent?
Okay. Yeah, I think the simplest way to describe it is, if you're a native English speaker, I imagine most people that are listening to this are, you can kind of think of English. English is a stress accent language. And what that means is English words have strong and weak bits. The strong bit of the word is the word that receives the stress. And if I say Japanese, then the stress is on the knees, Japanese. And that's also the accent of the word. So that word's kind of, bit that makes it stand out is the knees. And again, that's determined by stress. The accent is determined by stress. English is a stress accent language. And again, it has strong and weak bits. Japanese is a little bit different in the sense that words don't have strong and weak bits. They have high and low bits in terms of tone. So if I say the word for Japan, Nihon, the ho is higher in pitch than the ni or the n, but it's not receiving more stress in the sense that it's not stronger, it's not louder, and it's not longer in length than the other bits. It's just a little bit higher in tone. Now, there are certainly instances in which the accent in Japanese, the higher pitch, is said with more force than the surrounding bits. But what makes Japanese a pitch accent language, again, is the fact that the accent is determined by pitch rather than stress. So the simplest way to kind of, again, compare it to English is English words have high and low, or English words have strong and weak bits. Japanese words have high and low bits. And if you try and speak Japanese as if the words had strong and weak bits, then you'll sound foreign because you'll end up saying parts of words with too much force, lengthening parts of words, syllables. Syllables is probably the easiest way to describe it here, but you'll end up saying syllables too loud with too much force and too much length. And that's a characteristic, again, of a stress accent language. In Japanese, generally speaking, you just want to make the pitch of the accent a bit higher. So hopefully that's sufficient.
No, that was fantastic.
Yeah, no, I think that's
Okay.
a great explanation.
Yeah.
So at a high level, do you differentiate between pitch accent and syllable stress and intonation, or do they all kind of blend?
Yeah, so that's another fantastic question. I think the best way to describe it, that's funny you ask that, because one of the questions that I get most often on my Patreon, which is dedicated to teaching pitch accent, is, okay, I see in your lesson that this word, like Japan, has this pitch accent pattern, low, high, low. But when I'm hearing a native speaker say it in like this particular setting, it doesn't seem to match up perfectly with what you're saying. Why is that happening? Why is there a gap? And the reason for that is because, generally speaking, intonation, the way that a speaker maps their emotions and intentions onto words, that exists on top of pitch accent. So like in English, if I could say the word language, and the accent on language is almost in 99.9% of cases, it's going to be on the language. But it's not as if language is the only way to say that word. I could say language. I could say language. I could say language. There are many different ways to say that word. And when I map my emotions and intentions onto that word in different ways, it changes the overall sound of the word. Generally speaking, however, the accent is still always going to be on the lei. And so when you learn Japanese pitch accent, what you're learning is the basic shape that a word has, and thus how to naturally stretch and play with that shape. You can kind of think of it like, the example that I like to give is the word for student in Japanese is gakusei. But if you've never studied pitch accent and you're a native English speaker, you'll have the tendency to say it as gakusei. You'll put the stress on the ga. Again, you'll tend to say gakusei rather than gakusei. So you're working with the wrong shape, so to speak. And if you're working with the wrong shape to begin with, then even if you can naturally map your emotions and intentions onto that shape, and you can say gakusei or gakusei, all of those are going to sound wrong because you're playing fundamentally with the wrong shape. You got to get the fundamental shape right first, and then play with the shape after you get that.
That's so interesting because I've never thought of it like this, but now I'm seeing it in my head as like Tetris. Every word is like a Tetris piece, you know, it's coming down and you have to fit it.
Exactly. That's a great way to describe it. Yeah.
In conversations with other language learners, what tends to be the biggest roadblock for those pursuing a better pitch accent? Is it that they've already learned words and now they have to unlearn it and learn it with a new shape? Or is it something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really depends on how long that person's been studying Japanese. For people that have been studying Japanese for a long time, that's probably, yes, the biggest roadblock. There's a lot of bad habits that need to be corrected. But then I've also seen some people, and this is one of the reasons that I remade one of the lessons in my series recently to kind of talk about how pitch accent and intonation interact with each other, is because if you forget that intonation exists and you forget that the way that a speaker maps their emotions and intentions onto a words does change the overall sound of that word, even if generally speaking, the word will still maintain its basic shape. If you forget that happens and only concentrate on pitch accent, you end up sounding too robotic because you're essentially no longer mapping your emotions and intentions onto the words. You're just trying to get the pitch accent for every single word. So if I tried to do this in English, let's see, I've got a sentence from the interview questions that you sent me beforehand, and if I read this, what led to your interest in Japan and eventually living there? That's me saying it in kind of a relaxed way and putting distinct emphasis on the bits of the sentence that I believe to be important. Now, if I don't do that, and I just try and say each word of the sentence with the correct stress accent, then it'll sound like this. What led to your interest in Japan and eventually living there? So it becomes too robotic. So you got to
absolutely
learn what pitch accent is and exactly how to implement it into your studies. It's again, the basic word shapes, but it's not, you got to map your emotions and intentions onto that as well.
Do you find some of the language learners that study through your Patreon and your content, I guess figuring out which shape to apply to what words, like is there like there's patterns, right? There's got to be patterns.
Yes.
And do you think that's also a roadblock of like knowing at what point to use which pattern? It's
a intimidating challenge at first. And the reason that I say that is because what happens is when you learn that pitch accent exists and it's like this phenomenon in Japanese that you didn't know about before, then suddenly kind of what you're alluding to is you realize that every single word in the language, generally speaking, except for like, some like particles and that kind of thing, has their own shape, and you haven't been learning this shape up until this point. So it's like, do I have to relearn all these words now with like these shapes? But the great thing about learning pitch accent is that there are various rules that you can learn that will immediately improve your Japanese, because in learning like a single rule, and I'll give an example in a second, you immediately know the correct pitch accent for literally hundreds of words. So here's an example of that. There are many verbs in Japanese that end with the ts sound, tsu, ts. Every single verb in Japanese that ends with that sound belongs to the accented family. And what I mean by that is there's the accented family in Japanese and then the non-accented family. And many words belong to the accented or non-accented family. And that's why they kind of sound somewhat flat, and why Japanese teachers sometimes say Japanese flat, because they're kind of oversimplifying things. But many words do belong to the accented family, and they do have accents. So like if you say the word for stop in Japanese, you want to like stop someone, it's tomeru. It's flat. But if you say eat, it's taberu, taberu. It's not flat, it's low, high, low. And so some words have accents and some do not. But every verb in Japanese that ends with tsu has an accent on the second to last mora, kind of syllable of the word. So whether that's matsu, as in wait, or motsu, as in hold, or sodatsu, as in kind of grow up, or yakudatsu, as in be useful. It's little tricks like this. You learn the trick, and suddenly you know the pitch accent for multiple words by learning a single rule. And that rule only covers maybe 10 words, but the biggest rule, and I teach this on my Patreon, but I'll say it here, is that the overwhelming majority of 4 kind of syllable, the correct term is mora, but words that have 4 beats, that are nouns and have 2 kanji, so like gakusei or gakko or ginko or what would another good example be? Kyoiku, as an education. Almost all words that have that structure are accentless. And if you know that word, know that single rule, it immediately improves your Japanese in a single instance. Because if you can kind of just start with that basic rule and learn to kind of anticipate saying words in the sentence that fall into that structure, and you get really good at identifying those words as they're coming up in your conversation, that'll do more for your spoken Japanese than basically anything else. Because you'll stop saying dozens, hundreds of words with like an American overnight.
Well, we just got a Japanese lesson. Awesome.
Yeah, I need to start doing that for real. You should hear my accent sometimes. I sound like a freaking moron.
I mean, I still have a lot of bad pronunciation habits as well. I have trouble with the R sounds.
Yeah.
I have trouble with some of the N sounds, actually.
Yeah, the nasally.
I'm far from perfect, but I do try and share the knowledge that I have.
No, that's cool. You should totally make your marketing platform be like, learn Japanese pitch accent in 7 easy steps. Number 4 is going to blow your mind, one of those.
Yeah.
Fluent Japanese speakers hate this guy for this reason alone. Find out why.
Yeah. But yeah, the basic, what would you say, business plan has always been the product is the Japanese lessons, and then the advertisement is the comedic videos.
Yeah.
So hopefully people see those and they say, oh, this guy's Japanese is pretty good. Well, I wonder what this pitch accent thing that he mentions at the end of the lessons is. Maybe I'll go check it out. And I've been fortunate enough to have succeeded in that regard.
There you go. So Nigel kind of mentioned earlier briefly that we had Matt vs. Japan on for an episode in our first season.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked a lot about his immersion learning experiences and his relationship with Japanese study. And, with immersion learning, I'm sure it's natural for pitch accent and intonation to kind of be organically hammered into your brain. But do you feel like immersion learning is a must for anyone that is trying to pursue pitch accent Japanese study?
Absolutely. 100%. But I also want to stress that even if you're doing a completely immersion-based approach, which is kind of what I did for a long time and also what Matt did, is that unless you're first explicitly taught a little bit the fundamentals of pitch accent, even if you're doing immersion, 9 times out of 10, you won't be able to pick up on all the different patterns. You have to first kind of flip the switch on in your head, know what to listen for. Once that happens, you can start immediately, not immediately for most people, and certainly not myself, but within a month, in the overwhelming majority of cases, you can start to hear the 4 different pitch accent patterns in native speech. If you flip that switch consciously beforehand, explicitly, and watch the 20-minute video I have that's public on YouTube called the basics of Japanese pitch accent. If you watch that and then do immersion, it'll make the biggest difference in the world. Because just like Matt has mentioned this before, and I have as well, we did do immersion for multiple years, then learned that pitch accent was a thing after the fact, and realized that despite doing immersion, because we weren't kind of tuned in to pick up these things, we hadn't been taught to hear them correctly, we were missing them the whole time. Because when you're a native English speaker, basically, there are some pitch accent patterns that you can hear because they're similar, not identical, but to the stress accent patterns that exist in English. So you can hear some of the patterns, like a lot of native English speakers have the tendency to be able to pick up on, like again, taberu, low, high, low, because that's kind of like a lot of words in English that have an accent in the middle of the word. But then what ends up happening is you end up putting an accent on every single word in Japanese when many words in Japanese don't have an accent and or they have the accent on the wrong, on a mora that doesn't line up with the stress accent rules that you're unconsciously playing by when you listen to language, spoken language. So you got to get a little bit of explicit pitch accent study in early on in order to properly pick up on pitch accent in everyday speech.
Awesome. Yeah. No, and that's, I think a lot of us, I know, Nigel, you've wanted to do and done some immersion, like learning on your own, right?
Yeah, I actually am doing it right now. I'm kind of cheating because I'm doing it for Spanish, but you know, this whole time I've been thinking, you know, oh my God, here I am. I know about Japanese pitch accent, but I totally haven't even been thinking about it for Spanish. And I'm like, I've been sitting over here. This is crazy, but I've been sitting over here thinking basura, like basura, which means garbage in Spanish. And I'm like, am I saying garbage right? You know, when I think about it, I'm like, how am I pronouncing it?
Your pronunciation is garbage.
I believe that Spanish is a stress accent language. I think that it's in the same family as English.
Yes.
Double check
yeah, I'll
that.
check it. And Doug, I heard that, by the way.
Oh, yeah. I'm kidding.
But yeah, no, it's I've dabbled in immersion specifically with Japanese, and yeah, definitely, it's something that I found, like you said, you have to have that switch on in your brain, or else you just, you know, you will.
Yeah.
It'll. I don't know. It's like you'll hear it and you'll immerse, but it's just you're not cognizant of it. And like I said, it immediately made me think, oh my gosh, I don't even know if I've been cognizant of it with Spanish lately. So now I have to go and do a lot of reflection and pondering.
That's like me with Japanese all the time. Though I think back to, you know, I'm like, what I know now, I wish I had known in the earlier on, like, or just some of the experience. I'm like, I could have done this so many things differently in my approach. And yeah, it's definitely one of those things like, I wish I could turn back time just a little bit. I could be a little bit better than no communication, Doug. That's where I thrive, I guess. I don't know.
Well, one of the things that, you know, I hear a lot in the Japanese language learning community, whether it's from like university professors or even, you know, fellow YouTubers who really do dabble in the language learning, like Loretta, she is a YouTuber who, you know, does a lot of Japanese lessons. And everyone is always saying how important it is to have a language partner when practicing like verbal language skills. Would you say this is important with emphasis on pitch accent? Like, would you say that having a language partner would be helpful for like pitch accent study?
It can be immensely helpful. And what I mean by that is there are some people that need to get one-on-one feedback in order to get that switch to flip. Most people can just watch one of those videos that I mentioned earlier and kind of understand the basics and start to hear it. But there are some people that either need to have someone right in front of them and say, you think that you're saying it this way, but you're actually saying it this way, and or they need to hear a recording of themselves in order to actually hear what they're saying. And so with pitch accent, again, because a lot of the fundamentals are completely different, even if you think that you're saying something one way or think that you're hearing something one way, oftentimes you're actually not. And if you can get a language partner that knows even the fundamentals of pitch accent, if you just have like a Japanese native speaker watch one of those videos that I have up for on public on YouTube, it'll kind of immediately like, oh yeah, I understand what he's talking about. Yeah, totally. That's a thing. If you try and get pitch accent feedback from a native speaker that isn't aware of pitch accent in the sense that a lot of native English speakers, we abide by stress accent rules unconsciously, but unless you're taught it, it can be difficult to explain what's happening. If you try and get pitch accent feedback from someone who doesn't know exactly what pitch accent is, oftentimes they'll confuse it with intonation, and they'll say like, oh yeah, like you're kind of mapping your emotions and intentions onto words in an unnatural way. And sometimes it can be intonation, and sometimes it can be pitch accent. But again, those are kind of two fundamentally different things that play off of each other. So if you can find a native speaker that knows what they're talking about, at least at the elementary level, that can be a completely game-changing thing for improving your accent. And even if it's not pitch accent, we all have things in our Japanese, again, myself included, that I don't realize that I'm saying. I don't realize I'm making these mistakes as I'm speaking Japanese. And you kind of have to be a little bit forceful with some Japanese people. But if you make it clear that your goal is to sound as native as possible, and you ask them specifically, hey, we're language partners. The number one thing that I would like you to do is to try and find the bad pronunciation habits that I have with my language or with Japanese. If you can get them to point that out to you, because oftentimes you don't realize you're making that mistake. I went years not realizing that I was saying the R sounds the wrong way. Years. And it was only after someone pointed it out to me that I was able to even start trying to fix that. So whether or not the person knows about pitch accent, that's one factor, but even if they don't, 9 times out of 10, a native speaker will be able to provide some pronunciation feedback. And that's something that can be invaluable, because if that person isn't there, obviously you can go years like I did without ever getting that feedback.
So one, I imagine it's because, just like with English, you can not have the proper, stress, but like you said with Jackie Chan, you can still understand what he's saying, and people might not think to correct you, but
exactly.
Yeah. That's so interesting. So obviously your Patreon is one of the best resources out there to learn more about pitch accent. Mm-hmm. And you actually, earlier in the interview, I know our viewers can't see this or listeners can't see this, but you showed the NHK pitch accent dictionary. I don't know if it was called a dictionary. But,
yeah.
What other additional recommendations or supplemental resources do you recommend for pitch accent studying? If there are any.
That's kind of the thing. I hate to say this because I'm the one recommending my program, but I think that one of the reasons that I've been able to be successful with what I'm doing is because with pitch accent, obviously you need both the visual cue to see like the low and high, as well as the native recordings or just some kind of recording. I try and use native recordings as much as I can in my series, but I think one of the reasons it's been traditionally very difficult to study pitch accent is because you have to just read about it in like a textbook and maybe try and, what would you say, line that up with like a CD that's with that textbook. But because that's really only been taught at a very high level before, I think that it can be extremely intimidating for a lot of people. Immediately, like you're confronted with like a bunch of like high level linguistics terms, like, I don't know, glottal stop or, like mora. Again, it's like, what's a mora? I know what a syllable is, but what's a mora? What's a down step again? So one of the things that I try and do in my series is I try and take all those concepts and things that I've learned over the years, whether it was directly at university or getting feedback from native speakers, or across these various books that I quote throughout my series, is I try and take all these ideas and what would you say, kind of simplify them. I try and present them in a way that is easy to understand, even if you don't have a linguistics background. And I think the very fact that it's in video form, where you've got the visual cues and the audio cues, that kind of is what makes it an approachable thing for a lot of people. That being said, if you just, go on YouTube and type Japanese pitch accent, probably one of my videos will show up near the top, if not at the top. But you can watch the other videos too, and those are all going to be great resources as well. Because again, if it's a video and it's got visual cues and the audio cues, that's going to make a big difference. And I've seen multiple videos on YouTube that explain things just as well as me, if not better, for certain learners, definitely, just by going on YouTube and searching for Japanese pitch accent. So YouTube is, I would say, probably the best resource, as it doesn't require, it's something that anyone can immediately use.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And just to kind of finish that thought off, in trying to make more people aware of pitch accent, and Matt has been doing this too, other people, Japanese speakers as well, and Japanese YouTubers have started talking about it too. So I believe her name is, it's like Japanese Ammo, Misa.
Yep, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, she's got a video about pitch accent, I believe. And that's probably a great resource as well. So I would encourage everyone to look at all the options that are out there and try and find the one that works best for them.
Awesome.
In more people talking about pitch accent, more Japanese people are teaching it as well, and more non-native Japanese people are teaching it as well. So I think hopefully it benefits everyone.
Soon it'll be in universities.
I hope so.
Maybe we'll never get there. I don't know. But
You do some online courses, right?
Yeah.
And just to kind of, before we get back to or kind of wrap up everything, a lot of things too on our language episodes, we discuss like just the whole language journey that we all take, and big part of that learning a language and just getting from point A to point B and anywhere is making mistakes along the way and being able to laugh at yourself. Because I feel like sometimes, me personally, I learn the best from when I screw something up and I stumble over my own words, or I like say the wrong thing and then I get corrected inadvertently by a child in class, some kid lets me know. So all the, all those things, it kind of triggers like a way of memorizing how to do something right by doing something wrong. Do you have like a funny or memorable mistake that you've made during your language learning career that you'd like to share?
Dozens. I have dozens.
Oh, I know who that.
I'll give you two. One is at the beginning of study abroad, I had a mole on my skin that I was a little bit concerned about. I thought that maybe, I didn't know if it was like skin cancer or anything, but I was like, I should probably have a dermatologist look at this. And I knew the Japanese word for mole was mogura. But unfortunately, that's the word for the rodent that goes underground. Yeah. That's the other mole. So I called up a Japanese doctor's office and I said, I have a mole that I'm concerned about. Can you help me?
Oh, no.
And they were just like, excuse me? And I was like, I think it might be cancer. And they were like, what on earth are you talking about? And, it's impossible to make that connection unless you realize that in English, they're the same word. So even that I'm saying, I think it might be cancer, I'm saying, I think that this rodent might be cancer. They have no idea what I'm talking about.
You're calling the wrong people.
And we had 2 or 3 minutes of like this awkward phone conversation that ended up with me just being like, okay, I think I'll try like an English speaking doctor. So I hung up, I looked up the word to make sure I was getting it right. And then I saw that there's the 2 listings and I was like, Oh my gosh, that I used the wrong mole. So that was pretty traumatizing. That's one. And then the other one that I think is really, really funny is there are multiple words in Japanese that have the pronunciation kekko. One of them is like, it means, yeah, that's fine. Another one means the event will continue to go forward. It's often used in the phrase, I want to make sure I'm getting this right, uten kekko. Let me check that real quick.
Still unsure about it.
Yeah.
Even today.
I imagine that doctor's office is like every now and then they talk with their staff. Like, remember that prank call we got with the guy? You know?
Yeah. So it is uten kekko. Uten kekko means we'll do this event even if it rains. Uten means kind of like rainy weather, and kekko, it's different kanji than the normal like, yes, that's okay, kekko, and it means still gonna happen. And so I knew those two kekko, and I was planning a trip to go down to one of the tropical islands of Japan called Amami Oshima, and there was a typhoon coming, and I called up the ticket center, and I was like, is the boat still scheduled to go? And the answer that they gave me was kekko desu. And there's another word in Japanese, kekko, that means the boat trip has been canceled, or like the ferry has been canceled. I thought it was the like still going despite the rain, kekko. So I like this 5-minute conversation. It was like, oh, okay, yeah, cool, it's still going. Got off the phone, continued to like pack up my bags. But there was like some weird cues in my mind. I was like, that was kind of a weird conversation though. Like, why were we kind of speaking past each other? And then I called up like one of my friends that I was like planning to meet along the way. And I realized that I had been hearing the wrong kekko. And I was like, it went from me being excited to go to this trip to a tropical island to your trip has been canceled and you have to figure out another thing to do during this like rainy weekend. I was like, oh God.
Oh, yikes.
But I've used both of those in my Japanese skits. So at the end of the day, it's all ammunition for me. So
Japanese language, you gotta love it.
That's like Nigel and I joke a lot about the phrase "you good."
Oh my gosh.
I'm good. You good? And
Oh,
you just
yeah,
say I'm
yeah,
good.
yeah,
It can
yeah,
mean
yeah.
like a million different things. I'm good can mean, I'm all right.
Yeah.
Or I'm good means no, I
Absolutely.
don't want it.
Very similar to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or sumimasen can mean like, 20 different things.
Yeah.
Particularly the mole story.
That's so funny, right?
Yeah, and it reminds me. I'm like, man, how do I even speak English?
Yeah.
Like, the fact that we have two mole, like I would.
That's funny,
I wouldn't even
right?
think about that. I'm like, yeah, I'm like people. A lot of times, I hear people say English is pretty difficult to learn because things like that. Cereal that you eat versus a cereal like a serial killer.
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
like how do you differentiate? So,
Mm.
amazing. It points out how amazing Japanese is, but also how amazing that we've learned English too.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now I'm just thinking of like serial killers as like someone who wants to eat a lot of cereal.
Oh
It's
gosh,
like I kill this cereal, like eat whole bowls.
that's a
at
better
time.
image anyway.
Sorry, now
I can see that confusion
Yeah.
happening for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, before we wrap up, we want to just give you a moment to to pitch, your Patreon, to let people know where they can find you, like where they can follow you on social media, your YouTube channel. Just give you a moment just to kind of promote yourself, obviously, because you did such a fantastic job promoting yourself already, just talking us through pitch accent and giving us some kind of a basic tour of studying pitch accent. So, I mean, you've already sold us, I think, all three of us on going to learn more about pitch accent. But feel free to, just drop anything that you want to know, like where people can find you and whatnot.
Okay. Well, yeah, I am just Dogen, Dogen, on both YouTube and Patreon and on Twitter. And recently, my friend, Mr. Yabatan, he pushed me into making a TikTok. So I'm recycling my content on there as well. But
but I feel like your content could do well on TikTok though.
I
yeah,
was gonna say
yeah,
that
yeah,
too. Yeah.
Because it's so like precise and like to the point. I like this idea.
yeah. Unfortunately, like the aspect ratio is wrong for TikTok, but we'll see how it goes. But there, it's I think it's Dogen official, so it's a different name. But yeah, those are the main platforms that I'm on. I don't have an Instagram. I have like a kind of one that I was going to set up, but I ended up not doing it, and I don't think that I have time to like properly create new content for that. So for the time being, it's mostly just I try and do things mostly on YouTube and Twitter, and then for people that are interested in the pitch accent and pronunciation as well, I also teach not just pitch accent, but also like tongue placement, pronunciation, the various like how the vowels are said in Japanese, and they're actually almost identical to the Spanish vowels.
Yep.
Still thinking about if I'm saying garbage right.
I try and teach all those things on my Patreon for people that are interested in that. But yeah, that's probably it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's everything.
That's awesome. I mean, if people haven't found you on YouTube yet, I mean, they're about to, and they're going to get their minds blown.
Yeah,
It's going to be
exactly.
Don't set the expectations too high.
Oh no, but it's so fun.
No, I spent way more time on YouTube. I never. You can ask these two. I don't really go on YouTube, but I was like on your whole channel. I watched it through all your you were like the first person I did that for. So
I appreciate it.
I'm pretty sure you're the only person Doug watches on YouTube, because we were sending him stuff. We're like, this person. He's like, I've never heard of this person. I'm like, what? But he knows you. So that's great.
I'm the old man of the group.
Yeah. We'll be sure to link all of your social media accounts in the description for the episode, so our listeners can find you across Twitter, YouTube, your newfound place of TikTok as well. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, I learned so much. And I mean, I think not only for Japanese, but like I said, I've recently been learning Spanish, and it actually sparked some thoughts in my head about, taking what you were saying about pitch accent there in Japanese and applying that to Spanish as well. So obviously maybe not in the same way, but to think about the shapes of the language. And I think that's my key takeaway is the shapes and the Tetris patterns of language. So
yeah, one of the things that I like to say to people that are learning Japanese and pitch accent want to sound as native as possible is try and pay attention to the sounds of the language just as much as you're trying to pick up on the meaning of the words themselves. Just by doing that, you'll make a big difference, because typically when you start learning the language, at first you only have the capacity to pick up the meaning. But after a little bit of time, you start to get a little bit of wiggle room in the sense that you can pay a little bit more attention to the sounds as well. And just by trying to concentrate, really think about objectively and listen objectively to what's happening, what you're listening to, that'll make a massive difference.
And there you have it. I think we all have some homework to do then.
I'm going to go put on some Uneducated Fall Asleep too. Immersion learning through osmosis.
I know, right? Japanese ASMR, right? There you go. But again, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. And please, for all of our listeners, go and check out Dogen's fantastic work across his social media accounts. And yeah, that's it for us today. So
awesome. Yeah, thanks again for having me, and hopefully we can do this again in the future.
Yeah, it'd be great.
Absolutely.
Looking forward to it. And that's a wrap. That's all for today's episode. Bruh, I don't know about y'all, but I'm fired up to study some Nihongo. Big, huge, massive thanks to Dogen for joining us for this 2-part episode where we got to talk Japan, shared interest in Japanese language, pitch accent and study, and so much more. Have you ever studied Japanese pitch accent? Or maybe today's episode has you interested in learning a little bit more. If it's the latter, definitely check out Dogen's Twitter, YouTube, and Patreon. Then, after you do all that, head over to your favorite social media platform and give us a like, follow, share, whatever. Here comes your favorite part where I list out everything. You ready? On Twitter, we're at KREWEOFJAPAN, at Krewe of Japan. On Instagram, at KREWEOFJAPANPODCAST at Krewe of Japan Podcast. And on Facebook, you can find us at Krewe of Japan Podcast. And send us an email, kreweofjapanpodcast@gmail.com. I don't know if you need me to spell that out again, so I won't. And oh yeah, keep an eye out for us on YouTube in the coming months. We may have something special coming down the pike. We already got a few things out there, some fun stuff. Check it out. So that's going to be it for today's episode. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next week.